Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another in our sequence of programming around our Muscarelle explorations topic for this fall, the market for art. I'm David Brashear. I'm the director of the Muscarelle Museum, and I'm joined today by Elaine Ruffolo, our great friend here at the Muscarelle Museum, and I think it's safe to say our favorite art historian. Elaine taught for many years at Syracuse University's program in Florence, focusing in on the Renaissance. And I have to tell you, she is a widely sought after seminar leader, cultural tour organizer, and she has worked with leading museums from around the world. She has a virtual programming operation, and through her virtual programs, Elaine has thousands of followers. Art History Encounters is the name of her program. And she puts programs out on a weekly basis. So today, Elaine is going to talk to us about the artist in the Renaissance and that dance with patrons, how artists and patrons really interacted. Elaine, it's great to see you again. Thank you for being at the Muscarelle.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, David. I appreciate that lovely introduction. And I am going to share my screen right now. There it is. Lost my controls for a second so you can have something beautiful to look at.
And Elaine, before I disappear, not to interrupt you, before I disappear, I'm just going to let our audience know if you have any questions, you can post them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end of Elaine's presentation. Back to you, Elaine.
Thank you. Thank you again. So thanks for inviting me, David. It is always a pleasure to come to talk to the Muscarelle Museum. And always looking forward to working together in the future on some kind of fabulous program. And so today we're going to talk about the artist in the Renaissance, practice and patronage. And I love this topic. I'm coming to you, by the way, from Florence, Italy, where it's now 8 o'clock at night. And in the next hour, we're going to be going through many different aspects of the artist in the Renaissance and, of course, their dance with patrons. Now, no other place on earth houses the number of quality masterpieces that you can find in Italy. Buildings, statues, paintings are all interwoven in a tapestry before the visitor's eyes. Each city's paintings, which can include devotional images, you can find them on street tabernacles, frescoes in chapels, paintings on walls, confraternities, icons in dark churches, mythological, allegorical depictions, portraits, landscapes, and so on. It's truly an embarrassment of riches. And all of this gives each city its color and light and meaning. Now, of course, the magic unfolds thanks to artists such as Giotto, Masaccio, Frangelico, Botticelli, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and so on. And it's really thanks to these Renaissance artists that Italy gains her beauty and, of course, her fame. But they didn't do it alone. Patronage drives the Renaissance. I'm an economic art historian. I follow the money, and therefore we follow patronage. It's really thanks to the patrons. They paid for it all, and they made it possible, putting the artist and the patron into a kind of wonderful dance, and we are the great recipients of all that wonderful art. Now, what I'd like to do, organizing this talk, is look at first the artist in society, then we're going to talk about the Renaissance artist studio. Then, of course, I'm going to talk about patronage, and then specifically types of patronage, giving us an example of civic, private, confraternities, Renaissance courts, and the papal court. That's how I would like this presentation to unfold. Now, this is I love this image. I hope you can see it well. I found this, it's an old manuscript from Modena that shows the artisans. So get up close to your screen. You could see painters in there. I can see sculptors, armor makers, all manuscript workers, a delightful image as kind of a backdrop to the Renaissance artist studio. And you know, the word artist is a generic term that was almost never used in the Renaissance. A painter was called a painter or pittore. A sculptor was called a sculptor or a scultore, and so on. Only later with, of course, the great Michelangelo, Leonardo, Donatello, Jan van Eyck, Albrecht Dürer, do we start to get the term artist. Artists were seen as a member of a particular occupation rather than people with some kind of a great vision or special calling. I mean, that's how we think of artists today. They didn't have any special title, which implied that they were any better than anybody else. They were oftentimes, in terms of where they worked or lived, located in the same area of town. And the shops of the Renaissance artists were usually very small, like the images you're seeing here, where the front would be lifted up by raising a heavy wooden shutter, much like the shops that we see today, even along the Ponte Vecchio. I just pulled this off as an example. Now, rather than seeing all this lovely jewelry, just imagine that you'd be looking inside rather small shops for the artists. And you can really get an idea for that if you look above the shops, where you see there's a little tabernacle up there with the Madonna painted in, or these arches, giving you a glimpse into a much more medieval looking shop. And we can imagine them as quite humble and semi-private. Now, those shops would have been mixed into the dense fabric of a city in the Renaissance, Florence or Mantova or Urbino. And I love this image. This is actually in Perugia, because you can see that there are alleyways and buildings. And over here is a rather grand palace on the right-hand side. I'll get a bit closer. I can tell it's grand because it's outlined here with some marble, and the windows are outlined with marble. And there's a lady looking out the window with a monkey that's tied to the edge. It looks like a couple of notaries coming out the front door. And then over here, right in the corner, you can see an artist's shop. Probably rented part of the ground floor of this building, and they would be nestled in around the corner from a loggia or a church or a civic building. Yes, they tended to be near each other, but that wasn't a completely defined rule. Also, something to keep in mind that, say, a town in 15th century Italy was pretty small, especially following the period of the bubonic plague. For example, Florence in 1300 was a city of 100,000 people. By the time we get to, say, 1400, the city is no bigger than 37,000 people. And it could be traversed in less than 45 minutes on foot, which means that everybody knows everybody, right? Businesses are pouring out into the streets. People know each other. They're using nicknames all the time, especially with the artists. Just thinking about artist names is interesting. You know, it's very rare that you would have an artist with a last name. Michelangelo Buonarroti was an exception. Otherwise, artists were called Botticelli, which means the gold beater, or Verrocchio, which means Andy of the true eye, or Antonio Pollaiuolo, which means Andy the chicken seller, or Leonardo da Vinci, Lenny from Vinci. You see, they sound very grand, but they're actually nicknames indicating a kind of familiarity between artists, but also the people in, anyway, the city of Florence. The artists would come from a tradesman's class, just showing you an interesting image. It's actually German, but it'll do. They did not move in elite circles in the way that an artist does today, of course. Always Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Titian as the exception to the rule. Usually an artist came from an artistic family, following in the footsteps of his father or his uncle. He was part of, giving you another image, this is an artist studio, the master there in the center with his workers. He was part of a vast network of artists' interrelationships. I mean, always keep in mind how important the family was in Renaissance society. First came the family, la famiglia, then came your vicini. Vicini means your neighbors. Otherwise, it's your family, your parenti come first, and then your neighbors, and then comes your city. And certainly this parenti, or these relatives, would work together. Workshop equipment, drawings, know-how was passed down generation from generation to the next. Here's an interesting image of the Gaddi family. Tadeo Gaddi on the left, Zenobi Gaddi in the center, and Agnolo Gaddi on the right. They're all artists. And they're all, one is the father, the uncle, and the son. And this is very typical. You would move from generation to generation. Duccio, who I'm going to get to towards the end of my program, he had two sons who were both painters. Two of his nephews were painters. He married the daughter of a painter and went into partnership with his brother-in-law, who was a painter. So it seems that, especially in these early days, talent may have been secondary to kinship and, of course, experience. Now, let's put the artist and the patron into the hierarchy. We'll use Florence as our example, but we could be using another city as well. A wonderful image here of an idea of downtown Florence. Who's on the top and who is on the bottom? How does this all pan out? Well, at the very top, of course, is going to be the clergy. That could also include the papal court. Then comes the elite, and by that I mean the nobility, then professionals and bureaucrats. Then comes artisans, and then under the artisans are semi-unskilled workers, and then at the very bottom were the other, which would include wanderers, Jews, prostitutes, criminals, soldiers, physically or mentally challenged. They were at the bottom rung. Therefore, at the very top, we see where the patrons belong, and that's not a surprise. They're the ones who could, of course, afford the works produced by artists, and they came from the top two tiers of society: the church, confraternities, aristocracy, merchants, bankers, lawyers, judges. Especially in Florence, I can extend that to silk merchants and apothecaries and bankers and lawyers, really at the top, because they have the means to go ahead and commission works of art. The artist, in fact, is going to come from the middle rung, the lower middle rung of society, because they were producing goods in the same way that a baker or a cook or a tanner could do, shoemakers and tailors, and they were considered on the same level, especially in the 1400s. That's going to change with Michelangelo and Titian later on, thanks to Giorgio Vasari. But in this early period, they are right there towards the lower middle class. An artist could be compared to a wall builder. At the time, there was no such thing as an architect, for example. An architect was someone who worked with his hands, and he was considered a builder at the same level as, say, a stonemason. And here's an image of the Sculptors Guild. And it's really not until we get to the high Renaissance that the artist's status moves up. This is a 19th century image here of Julius II, the Pope, who's discussing the designs for a new St. Peter's with Bramante, Raphael, and Michelangelo. And I have no doubt that that probably happened. Probably not three of those guys in the same room, that's for sure. But the idea that the Pope is discussing things with those artists, that's not going to happen until we get until the 16th century. In the early days, they are definitely of low class. Now let's go a little bit further. The master, and it was always a man up until the 17th century, was in charge of the overall design of a commission, and he had the final say on everything that went on in his shop. He was at the top of his game. He was experienced. He was an independent artist, but he also had to arrange the rent of the shop. He had to negotiate commissions, sign contracts, keep the books, of course, pay the bills, and hopefully after all that, he could make some kind of a profit. So a good way to think of him is a craftsman, businessman. I mean, really no different than any other craftsman in the city, except that his product was, of course, what we're privileged to see, great art. Now, under the master were the apprentices, and you can see them here all throughout this room. They're grinding pigments, they're working on boards, they're doing the heavy lifting, as you can see. Sometimes they're sketching or copying what the master started. They are practicing on models. I always think it's interesting because it's not a nude model in the background. And these apprentices, they could be related to the master by blood. There's another image of the apprentices. Sometimes they're called garzone in Italian. They could be related by blood, but that wasn't necessary. And apprentices seem to have entered the artist shops in their early teens. The master agreed to teach a boy, provide for his safety, and sometimes pay him a small salary. An apprentice could last anywhere from 3 months to several decades. 14th century artist Cennino Cennini, he wrote something called the Handbook to the Artist, which I'll show you in a minute. He recommended 6 years minimum to be an apprentice. And obviously, the more sought after the master, the more commissions and the more apprentices he's going to have. Now, it was the apprentice task to assist the artist in the production of material and, of course, help him execute the work of art. So he would do the things that were less important. He's going to do, the fresco that's further up from us, or maybe he'll just work on the drapery. Raphael had a very fine apprentice who was good at painting garlands, and that's what he did. He made the garlands. But they could also be an assistant to a master, could be another master who might be out of work. For example, we know that Botticelli worked in Verrocchio's studio when he was out of work, or when Verrocchio had too much work and he had to kind of farm it out a little bit. And they worked for a limited period of time. So this is important to mention also that talented apprentices could go on to overtake their masters in talent, commissions, and fame. And of course, immediately what comes to mind is the example of Leonardo da Vinci, who outdoes his master, Andrea del Verrocchio. Andrea del Verrocchio is responsible for this exquisite bronze David on your right-hand side. And some art historians believe that that face of the David is based on the features of a young Leonardo, who was supposed to be incredibly handsome, with these bouncy curls and beautiful face. And according to Giorgio Vasari, who wrote the lives of the artists, Verrocchio said to Leonardo, who was at the time only 13 years old, "Let's see what you got, kid." And he handed Leonardo a paintbrush, and Leonardo picked it up and he painted this little angel in the lower left-hand side right here. And Verrocchio never picked up another paintbrush again. That's a great story. It does show that the apprentice can go on to overtake the master in fame. And certainly that was the case between Andrea del Verrocchio, Andy of the True Eye, and Lenny from Vinci. Now, let's also keep in mind that an artist, in Florence anyway, would have been caught up in rules and traditions regulated by guilds. And an artist guild or union, actually they existed throughout Italy. Even in Renaissance courts, which I'm going to get to. Sculptors belonged to the same guild as stonemasons and carpenters, while painters belonged, interestingly enough, so the top is the Sculptors Guild. See, it's the same guild that would have the wall maker. Here's the sculptor who's making a twisted column. It's very interesting. It's at a predella on the outside of Or San Michele in Florence. In the background, you can also see the tools of their trade, measurement devices. This character is making a capital. This character over here is carving a little statue of a little angel. And then the painters, however, didn't belong to that guild. They belonged to the Apothecaries Guild or the Pharmacists Guild, because that's where they would go to purchase their bright colors. And here down below, you can see the apothecaries busy grinding up their pigments, selling things on the shelves. And this guild was called the Arte dei Medici and Speziali. this actually was not very good for a painter because the pharmacist guild was very powerful, and that profession was very high on the economic and social scale, and the painters were not. Later on, they changed the guild for the artists, and the guild is called the Guild of St. Luke. I just showed you here, this is a painting by Giorgio Vasari showing us St. Luke, who tells Luke because there's an ox behind him, and he is looking up at the Virgin Mary, painting an image, and that supposedly happened miraculously, and now that's why the artist belonged to the Guild of St. Luke. Now, guilds were quite important. In general, they were helpful to the artist because it gave them a kind of certain status, kind of a certification as being a member. And the guilds would oftentimes have their own courts. They would help solve problems or smooth out conflicts. Let's say an artist, he died, maybe the guild will come in and help out his wife or his family. Maybe they can get together some money to pay for a dowry. These guilds were important for artists, and they also kept the quality of the work of art at a certain level. And in Florence, if you were part of a guild, you actually had a little say in the government as well. Minor guilds like the Guild of St. Luke had a small say in government affairs. And here's another image of this guild. This is the Sculptors Guild. Now, obviously, this is sculpture, but paintings always were in high demand in the Renaissance. And we tend to think of painters as producing only pictures, but this is definitely not the case in the Renaissance. Objects that kept Renaissance painters in business were much more mundane. They could be painting beds. Michelangelo, of all things, was gilded the knob, a decorative knob on the bed of the Pope when he was already very famous. The painters could paint shields, armors, altarpieces, chests, plates, what have you, cassone or hope chest. In fact, altarpieces and portraits that we think of as typical Renaissance paintings were relatively small in proportion to what other things were being made. So there's no hierarchy. Nothing was too good for a normal artist in the Renaissance. They were very happy to paint almost anything. They just wanted to get paid by the patron, which I'm going to get to. Now, I also wanted to mention that the artists in the Renaissance were sometimes wandering artists, and they could travel extensively, and they were willing to travel because they needed to have work anywhere. Now, of course, most of them would want to stay nearby home with their families, but a fair number would find employment further afield. For example, Florentine painters such as Bicci di Lorenzo, who was the son of Neri di Bicci, who was the father of Bicci di Lorenzo. I mean, they kind of get stuck on a broken record. They worked for numerous villages throughout Tuscany. And Bicci di Lorenzo, that's the painting I have right at the top of your screen. It's very lovely, gold background, Madonna surrounded by saints. I'll get a little bit closer. And when I tell you the date, you're going to be surprised. This dates 1480. I mean, long after Masaccio, Filippo Lippi's come on the stage, but there was a taste for the conservative. And that's why the Bicci di Lorenzo, Lorenzo di Bicci, and Neri di Bicci generations found plenty of work in the provinces. On the other hand, cutting edge artists such as Duccio, who you see in your lower right, and the great Giotto on your lower left, they would be called to other towns because of their fame. Even rival towns, which is pretty interesting. For example, Duccio gets called to Florence when Florence and Siena hate each other, which we'll find out a little bit later. And Giotto will make his way to Rome. This is interesting for many reasons because it exposes these artists to different cities, and it brings their style to other cities. And that's how we can mix it up, not only between different artists, but also different centers. Right now, how do we know all this? How in the world am I so sure about what's going on with these artists? And for that, we look at the documents. How do we know and what do we know? And thanks to the fact that the cost of paper went down in the 11th century, and the fact that these, especially Florence and Venice, had a tradition of writing things down because they're centers of business, we actually know quite a bit about the life of a Renaissance artist. Now, here are the different documents that we use when trying to figure out what's going on. Catasto, which means tax records, wills, judicial records, shop books, inventories, and manuals. Now, starting at the top, the catasto is something really interesting. That goes into place in Florence in 1427. And all Florentines were obliged to fill out a catasto or tax record. And that's how we're able to know the artist's age, any work that he left unfinished, who still owed the artist money, who did the artist still have to finish up a work of art. Wills, of course, are documents that are useful in finding out the artist's relatives or which church he was associated with. Judicial records tell us if the artist was ever in trouble, maybe he's taken up on charges for not finishing something, as Leonardo was. Shop books, which are quite informative and interesting. Not all artists kept shop books, but some did. And an especially detailed one comes from that Neri di Bici guy I mentioned, which was like a private diary. And he entered every single day the business of his shop, written in very brisk business tones, and it runs over 400 pages, giving us information that runs from the acceptance of a apprentice to the purchase of grain to the commissioning of a painting. It's just filled with interesting documentation. And then another kind of documentation is a shop manual, and the most famous of which is Cennino Cennini's Handbook to the Artist, which was written in the 14th century. And what Cennino Cennini was trying to do was he was aiming to preserve and pass on the accumulated knowledge and technique of a workshop. He puts it all together in one book, which is going to range from how to make a manuscript, how to do bronze work, how to make a fresco, tempera paint. He even dabbles a little bit of a mention in oil painting. And he'll tell us the techniques or how to formulate the very best rabbit skin glue, what kind of fur to use for brushes, the types of oil, and where to get, my favorite is at the bottom, where to get the very best eggs for tempera paint. A city hen rather than a country hen, just in case you were wondering. And then finally, the source for understanding the life of an artist will come from letters and treatises. Now, letters, of course, were usually written to clarify a point with a patron, or maybe a letter back and forth to a family member. For example, Michelangelo wrote many letters back and forth to his father and his brother. And he'll mention a commission to a family member, how it's going, or how he felt at the time. So letters are quite useful. Writing could also be found in treatises. And the three men I have up here wrote treatises. Leon Battista Alberti wrote a treatise on architecture, De Re Edificaria, and then Della Scultura on sculpture, and Della Pittura. He was a great theorician. He was actually nobility and followed, he was a papal prelate. So he was traveling around Italy with the Pope at the time, and very useful to read his treatises. Then in the center, probably a man that you're familiar with, that's going to be Giorgio Vasari, who wrote the lives of the artist. And he will very carefully, starting with Giotto and ending with Michelangelo, put everybody in line. Now, the problem with Giorgio Vasari is that he's quite Tuscan-centric. I mean, he mentions Titian, but The majority of his great artists will be from Tuscany, because after all, that's where he's from. And he tells us a lot about the individual artists. Let me just go a little bit further with Giorgio Vasari. Not only will he tell you what the life of the artist was like, but he manages, the first one, to elevate the status of the artist to someone that we could take interest in, someone who was looking beyond just making money but making art for a greater purpose. And that happens in 1555 with his book on the lives of the artists. And the last is Benvenuto Cellini. I should have put Ghiberti in here as well, thinking about different treatises. And Benvenuto Cellini wrote a treatise and also wrote an autobiography, which tells everyone about his life. I mean, he makes it sound as if he's the greatest artist that was ever since Praxiteles. He single-handedly saved the Pope from the sack of Rome. It's all hubris, but it's a primary source that art historians can go to try to understand what was going on. All of these sources are primary sources, which are invaluable to the art historian. And these tax records, inventories, diaries give us a very good picture of the life of an artist in the Renaissance. Now, clearly, art mattered. It mattered in the Renaissance, and viewers expected works of art to be meaningful, purposeful, and functional, not just beautiful. Art served a special function. Art could be part of devotion or commemoration, could be a corporate activity. It could show familial ties. It could also be about propaganda. And this is where the patron comes into play. And in virtually all cases, a work of art was commissioned rather than produced by an artist on his own initiative. Instead, it was commissioned by the patron. And the term patron is complicated because sometimes a patron can imply someone who is behind you and kind of manipulating things behind the scenes, politically and socially. And that's called client, it's called, never mind, doesn't matter. I'm going off in a wrong direction. Instead, for our purposes, the patron is somebody who is going to pay for a work of art and ask you to produce it. It not always is one person. It can be an individual, it could be a government body, a religious organization, it could be a social institution or a family, just to name a few. When referring to the purchase of a work of art by a patron, the Italian term is mecenatismo, okay, which is patronage for a work of art. It comes from a name of a very wealthy Roman, renowned for his enormous wealth and luxurious living. And I'm showing you a picture here. I'll show it many times. It's the best image I could come up with of a patron. And that's Lorenzo the Magnificent here in the center. He is surrounded by artists who are bringing him the works of art that he has ordered. That's supposed to be the young Michelangelo coming in with this marble faun as a presentation to him. And you can see the activities going around. This painting is by an artist named Giovanni di San Giovanni. So all Renaissance patronage was based on this system that is quite different than our own. There are no art galleries where a patron could simply choose an already finished work of art. Things had to be made to order, and the patron would tell the artist what to paint, what to carve, what to build. And furthermore, the patron would often decide on the price, tell the artist what kind of materials to use, how big the work of art should be, when it should be delivered. And it's really fascinating to take a look at the contract. Here's a contract, just to give you an idea, because the contract for a Renaissance artist was a legal instrument. And it was common and traditional for the painter to worry about materials, the quality of the materials that the artist used, and they insisted on fine materials that would last. Especially the wealthy patron like Lorenzo the Magnificent, he wanted value for their money, and he was extremely concerned with the physical aspects of material and the work of art. Going back to Lorenzo, usually the patron entered into a contract with an artist that specified exactly how much the artist would be paid, what kind of materials would be used, and how long it would take to complete the work of art, and also the subject matter. I mean, this isn't exactly artistic freedom, but it did have its advantages because the artists weren't expected to paint something and then hope it would sell. Also, patrons would oftentimes specifically ask to be included in a painting like this. Beautiful work by Jan van Eyck, just leaving Italy for a moment, because this thing is so beautiful. You can see there is the portrait of the patron is to the left of the Virgin Mary, our right. And when the patron appears in a painting, the referral is he is the donor. He's shown here kneeling to the left of the Virgin Mary. Commissioned works of art, whether they were generated by the state or church or monastic communities, civic, corporate groups such as guilds, were all conceived with specific goals in mind. And those goals were meant to be conveyed publicly, because you would see the work of art if it was a public work of art, obviously. Sometimes there's a specific message, often much more complex than their subjects would even indicate. So private patrons, like the Duke of Urbino, shown here kneeling down in front of the Virgin, surrounded by saints, this exquisite painting at the Brera in Milan. This is a presentation of a work of art to a church, with the expectation that God and the saints would reward the Duke of Urbino with a gift of salvation. And also interesting to mention, despite the dominant role of males in the Renaissance, sometimes you had female patrons. Here's a nice little example of an early one, the earliest image, one of these early images at the Uffizi. This is called the San Remigio altarpiece. It dates about around 1350, so right during the bubonic plague. And it's a lamentation of Christ and deposition. But you can see over here on the left-hand side, there's Saint Remigio with his hand very carefully on the head of the young woman in contemporary dress. And over here, Saint Benedict with his hand on the head of a nun who must have been the patronesses of the altarpiece. We don't even know what their names are, however. Rulers could, of course, they were expected to beautify a city, but they also wanted to be shown in great honor. This is Lionello d'Este from Ferrara, shown here in all of his glory with his roses, symbolic of the Este family. And religious or civic orders were also important patrons, where stories could be told, including the patrons who were members of, let's say, the confraternity. So these are all interesting types of patronage. Now, how did it work exactly, this relationship between one artist and a patron? How did they find each other? Now, many ways. Now, remember, I mentioned earlier that these towns were relatively small. Florence, under 45,000 people, and the lower middle class lived very close together. And the upper middle class were all shoulder to shoulder. So physically, I think the artist and the patron were aware of each other. And then, as is today, a patron will get a referral from a friend or a family member. For example, Lorenzo the Magnificent, again in the center of this painting, he asked his uncle for advice about a new young kid who could come into his sculpture garden. His uncle's name is Giovanni Tornabuoni. Giovanni Tornabuoni's had Michelangelo was working for the artist who was painting his private chapel. See, so everybody knows everybody. Or in turn, Lorenzo would recommend a talented artist to another powerful patron. He recommended Leonardo da Vinci to, for example, the Sforza family in Milan, and Leonardo wrote his own letter of recommendation and took off for Milan. So it's through this parentela, these kind of ties that were going on. Also, a patron just logically could walk into a church, look around at different chapels, and inquire about the artist who executed something that he found appropriate for his needs and obviously also appropriate for his means. I mean, remember, only the wealthiest can afford a Filippo Lippi on your left. Otherwise, you end up with a Neri Bici on your right. So once an artist and a patron come together, the artist has got to submit a drawing or a model. In the case of sculpture, it's a physical model. In the case of architecture, sometimes you could get a whole wooden mini version of what he had in mind. The one at the bottom is a wooden model of Palazzo Strozzi by Giuliano da Sangallo. And then on your upper left, that is a drawing by Leonardo da Vinci, which was a preparation for a great altarpiece. He actually displayed this for a few months for people to come and admire. And then on the right-hand side, I have a romantic image again of Pope Julius. And that way, the patron could understand or expect what they could expect for the final product. These are called presentation drawings. They had the weight of a legal document, as did the models. And the designs of these presentations were expected to be followed closely for the finished product. We have lots of surviving contracts between patrons and artists. They're legal documents, and they don't, of course, describe virtually anything about the complicated exchanges that must have occurred, but they are the bare bones business contracts of what the artist and the patron wanted. And I think it's really interesting that these contracts also frequently mention that the work had to be done by the artist's own hands, kind of recognizing that these workshop practices could include someone else coming in. They would stipulate, of course, the quality of the pigments. This is a beautiful painting. It's a the Uffizi. This is called the Adoration of Kings, and it's up here because the materials are so sumptuous. And Paolo Strozzi, who commissioned this work of art, in his contract, he's right here. He's holding this bird, which is a falcon, which is strozziere in Italian. That's how we know it's Paolo Strozzi. And he's going to indicate to Gentile da Fabriano what kind of pigment he wanted, the right kind of lapis lazuli, the gold, and he wanted to make sure that it was exactly the quality. So the patron really has an upper hand. Okay, so that I think gives us a really good idea of how the patron and the artist work together, what life was like for the artist. Now let's just take, in these last 15 minutes or so, take a look at different examples of patronage. And I thought it might be interesting for us to not just stay in Florence, of course, but to move around to Italy and choose a civic image from Siena, a family chapel in Florence, confraternity in Venice, courtly patronage, and of course, Rome, papal patronage. And the examples I chose are not only divided geographically, but in terms of patronage, but also in terms of time. So I'm going to go very early, and then I'm going to go all the way to the 17th century. And we start with the earliest, which is in Siena. And at the beginning of the 13th century, the two greatest towns in Tuscany were Florence and Siena. Florence was wealthy because of the textile industry, and Siena because of banking and her location on the pilgrimage route. Florence was aligned with the papacy, Siena was aligned with the emperor, Florence was a city of 100,000 people, and Siena was a city of 60,000 people, and they were in major competition. And finally, in 1260, the lines were drawn, hostilities boiled over, and the two armies would meet and have a battle, which is called the Battle of Monte Perti, which is Monte Aperto, open on this, between this land or mountain. And it turned out to be one of the bloodiest battles of the late Middle Ages. The Sienese were outnumbered 2-1. On the lower left-hand side of this battle scene are the Florentines. You can tell because they've got their giglio or the lily. And on the upper right-hand side are the Sienese. You can tell because they're holding black and white shields. And the battle commenced just at daybreak. Now, as I said, one of the bloodiest battles of the Middle Ages. The Sienese were outnumbered 2-1. But because maybe the sun was in the eyes of the Florentines, or because of a very careful rear flank move on the Sienese, or much more likely, according to the Sienese, because of the intervention of the Virgin Mary, the Sienese won. And it ushered in this golden age of Siena, which saw a building boom, an incredible surge of civic pride. And between 1260 and 1348, Siena was in this golden age, and Florence wasn't secondary, but she was set aside. And that's where the great rivalry between those two cities began in 12. Even today, if you go to a soccer match between Florence and Siena, the Sienese fans will chant, "Remember Monteperti." I mean, get over it already. 1260 was a long time ago. But in celebration of that victory, the Sienese, of course, wanted to show their civic pride. So they commissioned, the city of Siena commissioned the artist Duccio di Buoninsegno to create a work of art to commemorate the victory and represent the importance of Siena. And this is the finished product. One of the most wonderful images of the late Middle Ages. Now, part of this is a reconstruction because unfortunately things were cut up and sawed in half and sold off to different museums. But this is a reconstruction of what this giant image looked like. Here's what it looks like today. And on October 9th, 1308, the head of the cathedral workshop signed a contract with Duccio for this large altarpiece for the Cathedral of Siena's main altar. And what we can see right in the main altar is the image of the Virgin Mary, which expresses visually the dedication of the city of Siena, even though it's a religious image, to the Virgin Mary. And it was completed in 1311. Its installation at the high altar was an occasion of great celebration. The panel was removed from Duccio's workshop on the outskirts of the city. And imagine carrying this thing all the way through Siena into the Campo, up the hills, and Siena's on 3 hills. And this thing, after all, is enormous. And we know that the day that the altarpiece was carried to the Duomo, all the shops were shut. We have a primary source for this. A procession began with the bishop, priest, friars, and the Sienese all accompanying this work of art through the city. And the work of art is 7 feet tall and 13 feet wide and painted on both sides, processed through the city, really showing us an excellent example of civic patronage with this early period, Duccio's Maestà. All right, let's go on to our next example. Another kind of patronage, especially popular in Florence, are family chapels. And I just popped 2 up here. These are, I know they're a little bit hard to see, but I wanted you to give an idea of what they look like from the outside of a family chapel. You go into a church and it's dark, and along the left or right-hand side, you'll see usually an iron gate. Sometimes they were wood with a door, this one open, and they were the kind of gate that you can see through, and up and behind you can see frescoes Here, just behind that gate, I can see a little altarpiece. Over on the right, same thing. This is the Riuncini family chapel, to give you an idea. Now imagine walking into a church and looking on your right and left-hand side and deciding, well, which service should I go to? It's kind of like going to a big, multi-cinema. Which movie should I take a look at? And you would choose these, and the artist would, the priest would be saying mass, and you might go to the Riuncini chapel one day, or maybe want to go to the Te Deo chapel the next day. So what happens is at the end of the 13th century, the rule about getting buried outside of the church is lightened up. Originally, you had to be buried outside the city walls in Roman antiquity. Then you had to be buried in the church boneyard. But finally, right at the end of the 13th century, that rule lightens up, and everybody wants to have their own family chapel, or I should say, wealthy patrons. And they wanted to be buried there, they wanted to get married there, and above all, they wanted to have mass said for their souls there. It's a very active area, lots of things going on. And in turn, the patron had to pay for the iron gate. The patron had to pay for the wax, the candles, the cleaning, the frescoes, the altarpiece, and give a donation to the church because they wanted to have mass said every day. That was the duty of the monk, to pray for the souls of the patron, pray for the souls. And this is what it looks like from the exterior, but this one is our specific example. This is found in the church of Santa Trinita in Florence. It's the view of the Sassetti Chapel. Now try to imagine that at one time there would have been an iron gate with a door in the middle. That also helps us understand why these chapels are so tall, so that you, if you're way back in the middle of the church, you look forward and you can see this whole upper side. Then you can look way up, and I can see the family crest. This is the Sassetti coat of arms at the top. Then here I can see a ring, no doubt used for a lantern. And then I can see the tops, which are going to be the 4 evangelists. Then I can see scenes from the life of Saint Francis. Why Francis? Because the name of the commissioner was Francesco Sassetti. Turns out to be his namesake. And this is all done in, of course, good fresco, done by the artist Domenico Ghirlandaio, who was the hottest painter in Florence in the end of the 15th century, hands down. Let me give you a close-up. So these family chapels, they have many functions, but then they're trying to outdo all other family chapels. And then the artists are looking around and taking little bits and pieces from pre-existing works of art and incorporating them into the frescoes. That's what Ghirlandaio did. And Sassetti also wants to show himself as being pious, but also showing off who he knows. But down below here on the lower right-hand side, you can see Francesco. There he is, very formal. He's in profile. He looks pious. And he's praying into the image of the Virgin who's just given birth. And over here is his wife. Her name is Neri di Corsi. So she's also of a noble family. Then, even more interesting is what's going on here. You can see Francis, who's resuscitating this kid who's being brought up from his, miraculously, he had fallen out this window. You can see him falling out the window there. Then Francis comes and cures him. But much more interesting, over here on the right-hand side, you can see that these characters are all dressed up in contemporary garb. And I always like to point this out because this is the artist Domenico Ghirlandaio, looking out with his hand on his hip as if to say, I painted this. Here's another detail. But remember, it's the patron that's important, not the artist. Francesco Sassetti is shown here. You can see the guy that's balding. And who's right next to him? Lorenzo the Magnificent. And in the background, I've got the city of Florence. But this is a celebration of the patron's family, and who the patron knows. Who are your people? Well, the people of the Sassetti were the Medici. In fact, the Sassetti ran one of the Medici banks in Rome. So excellent example of a family chapel. Now let's go to Venice. Here's beautiful Venice. For our patronage, Venice was dominated by three social classes, very no upward movement whatsoever, very strict, quite different than Florence. At the top are going to be the patricians, and that's where the Doge belongs. In the middle, we got the cittadini, who are the citizens, and at the bottom, we have the popolani. 1% are the patricians, about 10% the cittadini, and the rest popolani, just the regular people. Now, that's not good for a city because there's no way to express any kind of civic pride, or you have no say in the government. And that's why we start to see citizens and popolani joining charitable organizations called scuole or confraternities. They're sort of like mini cities within a city. And otherwise, they have no outlet for their patronage or no way of expressing their piety nor their wealth, because the city of Venice was controlling all the patronage. Now, thanks to the scuole, some of the greatest works of 15th century painting are produced within the scuole, inside the confraternities. And these are like boardrooms. That's a good way to think of it. Big meeting rooms, and then upstairs there's these special boardrooms for the confraternity, and you could be commissioning these works of art. This is a wonderful procession in Piazza San Marco, painted by Gentile Bellini, right around the same time that Ghirlandaio was painting the Sassetti Chapel. And Gentile Bellini, he's the older brother to the more famous Giovanni Bellini. He was a superb draftsman. He worked in these Venetian scuole who had a real appetite for his documentary style. And you can see this annual procession of all the scuole and reading citizens following the image of the cross. But if you look down carefully, they're all filled with portraits of members of the confraternity. Or another example of scuole painting is by Carpaccio. It's going to be a big Carpaccio show at the National Gallery coming up in 2023 that you shouldn't miss. And it records every single plank. This is the Rialto Bridge before the Rialto Bridge was built. And you can see that Carpaccio gives us every plank, every nail, exactly how it was built. And then it gives you every kind of rooftop or every variation on a Venetian chimney pot possible. So it's like a little wonderful snapshot of the city of Venice. And then the last one I'll show you will be from Renaissance courts. Renaissance courts were always about the patronage of the prince, and every court reflected the embodiment of the prince. Very different situation than Siena or Florence or Venice. From the physical structures, the decorations, court ceremonies, the role of patrons rested on one man, solely the taste of the prince. And I chose Urbino as our example because of the great prince, or the Duke of Urbino. Duke of Urbino was quite an isolated place. And Piero della Francesca, who was a wandering artist, would make his way and spend time in Urbino glorifying the Duke of Urbino and his wife. And that's where these famous paintings come in, the portraits of Federico di Montefeltro and Battista Sforza, painted in 1465. Today at the Uffizi, it is a commemoration of a marriage, also a death. The Duke of Urbino is shown here as a humanist wearing these beautiful deep red clothing, very wealthy. He's in profile, which is supposed to make you think of a Roman emperor's coin. He has domination over his countryside. He's got that terrible profile. I'm sure you're wondering what's going on with the nose. He lost his right eye and his right ear in a joust. Then he foolishly had the cartilage removed from the top of his nose so his left eye could see what was coming on the right. Yeah, so Piero della Francesca does not idealize him, but gives it to us with his warts, his wrinkles. He had some kind of a skin problem as well, but he looks honorable, bringing you over to his lovely wife, Battista Sforza, who is shown in commemoration. The patron wanted the image of his wife, even though she had recently died. She had a girl and a girl and a girl and a girl and another girl and a son, and died. And she's there through the patronage of the Renaissance Duke, who loved his wife and put her in there posthumously. And that's probably why she looks so pale. It's a wonderful image of the patronage of a Renaissance court. All right, I'm going to stop there and be very happy to take some questions. I just hit 1 hour, and remind you that the patronage and the artist in the Renaissance is one of the most interesting topics. And I think it fits in beautifully for your theme that you have going, David. And I hope you enjoyed that and learned something.
Fantastic, as always, Elaine. So I'm not seeing any questions yet, but of course, as you might imagine, I have one. So we have these patrons and we have these artists out there, and they're interacting. And let's take Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, as our example. When an artist comes to him, is he going to work? Is he going to understand what that artist generally commands for a work? Or is the artist going to understand what Lorenzo generally pays for a work? Where is the leverage? Who has the upper hand in this negotiation, if it even is one?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because if it's Lorenzo the Magnificent, it would never be the artist coming to Lorenzo. It would always be Lorenzo calling the artist. And because of his power, and actually Lorenzo was not as wealthy as you might think. He was very powerful in terms of manipulating the culture and the reputation of Florence, but he wasn't the same banker that his grandfather, his great-grandfather, or his father was. And he, more than patronizing individual artists, he takes care of them. That's when I was starting to go down that rabbit hole with you, and I stopped myself. That's what I meant by this clientism, that he would help the artist find the right job rather than always patronizing them. He had a taste for the antique, collecting gems and things like that. The price is going to be based on the wealth of the fame of the artist, and of course the wealth of the individual. You'll pay one thing for a Neri di Bici and a whole nother thing for a Filippo Lippi. As an idea, I'll give you Leonardo, who was quite well known, was paid 100 ducats a year to work for the Duke of Milan, which is fine. That's about the salary of a tailor, to give you an idea, but pretty good. Even though it's Leonardo, you think, wow. Michelangelo was paid 400 ducats just for the David by the city of Florence, just to give you kind of a reference of what's going on.
And when Leonardo was being paid that amount to work in Milan, was that generally considered to be his job then, or was he able to do other things?
Yeah, excellent question. And I don't know if that analogy I just gave you is that fair, because also on top of that, like Mantegna, who I didn't get to, Leonardo was given a place to live, he was given food, he was given firewood, he became part of the Renaissance court. So he might not have made as much money as Michelangelo, but he was certainly taken care of. Good questions, David.
Well, Elaine, you have peeled away the onion for us once more. You've helped us understand patronage in the very beginning. I think we can almost say that the Renaissance is really sort of that a big inflection point in sort of creating a marketplace for art, right? You know, you have all these active, patrons and all of these active artists sort of beginning to come together in ways that I think is somewhat new, at least at that scale in the times of the Renaissance. Would you agree?
Yeah, so an interesting way to think of it, and that Walter Schmidt had his hand up, I saw.
Yes.
Is that in the late Middle Ages, the patron is going to be the church. or a king.
Right.
And that's it. And the Renaissance, boom, you did all this other kinds of patrons that I was trying to describe. And then right around the time, David, of Caravaggio, that things start to change and the artists begin to make works of art that are on display in a shop, and the patron can come and choose. That happens around 1600. And then, of course, it takes off with the Baroque, and you start to think about the Netherlandish painters, or etc. And then it gets to be much more modern.
Great. And I'm seeing if I can get our hand raise. Walter, I'm going to allow you to talk and ask your question. You'll have to unmute yourself, though. I think you can do that.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Hi, Walter.
I was just wondering if patrons once in a while will compete against each other. With other words, raise the fee they might pay to a very famous artist.
Yeah, I gotta think. Well, yes, yeah. I can just off the top of my head, you're absolutely right, Walter. I'm thinking about Titian. Titian, who would sign a contract, and then Charles V offered to pay him more. So he stopped the work that he was doing for the Church of the Frari to work for Charles V. Another example is Michelangelo, who signed the contract for making the David. It made him famous. And suddenly he had about 10 different commissions that he started and then would set aside because he would get a better offer. Or Leonardo da Vinci, who painted the Adoration of the Magi. He did the underpainting for a monastery just on the edge of town in Florence. And he never finished it because he got a better offer from the Duke of Milan. And actually, Leonardo got sued for that and lost the suit. He had to pay a fine. And Filippino Lippi ended up painting the altarpiece for that monastery. Excellent question.
Thank you.
Sure. It's all very
Well,
modern, isn't it?
Are there any other questions? Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and I especially want to thank our good friend Elaine Ruffolo for sharing all her great knowledge with us once more. Elaine, great to see you, and we're looking forward to seeing you in person sometime soon.
Hopefully. Thank you again, David. I appreciate it. Lovely to see everyone.
Everybody have a great day. Thanks so
Ciao,
much.
ciao, ciao.